I put in a couple of slides of the ridiculous things I used to do before I got into farming, because I think it's important. All of these were considered impossible at the time I was doing them. Whoops, okay, come on, let's move that slide. There. When I was told that small farming was impossible, I figured, okay, this is something I want to do because I love doing the impossible. It was not easy from the start. This is me and my wife dressed up in our very fancy work clothes, because very often it's cold and wet and you're out there for long hours. But it has been and continues to be the most satisfying work I've ever done in my life. When we started here, it was all forest. It was all mainly a spruce and fir forest. And that was because this was the only land I could afford. Now, the soil under a spruce and fir forest is usually very acid and very poor. And in this part of the world, thanks to the glacier 10,000 years ago, it was filled with rocks. So it took a great deal of work to start with that, first getting rid of the trees, getting rid of the stumps, getting out the rocks, and then trying to put fertility into this soil. I am so glad I had to do that, because in the process, I learned a great deal about soil fertility and how it works and how to make it work better. If I had started on 4 feet of deep loam somewhere, I would never have had to learn as much as I had to learn. So we were able to start with that background. Okay, let's move on here. And turn it into something that actually worked. And we did that by rounding up every scrap of organic matter we could in the neighborhood. If there were abandoned hay fields, I would get permission to cut the hay on them, bring it back, compost it. And then we had a very small walk-behind rotary tiller, even smaller than the BCS or the Agria that people use nowadays. But that enabled us to mix the organic matter with the soil. We mixed in lime, we mixed in clamshells from our fishing neighbors, and we were able to totally transform the soil. Now, in the process, we realized that we were not going to find help anywhere, because at that time, the propaganda from the government, from the Department of Agriculture, and from every university condemned what we were trying to do as foolish and impossible. But fortunately, I'm a product of the 60s. And one of the things we all learned back in the 60s is not to pay any attention to government pronouncements. In fact, to be very suspicious of why they were being made. Well, obviously, the enmity for organic was because it was a risk to the profits of the chemical companies who were controlling agriculture and controlling the information. So despite all of that, we persevered. So did other organic farmers. And in the process, I learned an awful lot. And I learned a great deal of it because I have a passion for books. And since there were no models I could follow, I have a library. I'm sitting in my office now, where that library is on all the walls. And I learned a great deal from that. And what I learned is that over time, whenever ideas have threatened chemical agriculture has very slowly co-opted the words. That is, they've taken over the words and redefine them so they could put the new ideas into the background. And that is what I have seen happening recently with the new excitement about regenerative. Now, I've noticed on the Stiftung website that you have an article there in praise of regenerative. And it bothered me because it seemed like none of the new young organic farmers in Germany had any idea of the background. Now, I was fortunate in 1974, and that's a long time ago. We started here on the farm in 1968. But I was fortunate in 1974 to be able to go to one of the first international organic farming conferences. It was held in Paris, sponsored by Nature Progrès. And it was just amazing. I met all the European organic farmers. I became involved with IFOAM. And over the course of the next year or two, having seen on visits after that conference how well European organic farming was happening, I planned tours for Americans to come visit farms all over Europe. And we would rent Volkswagen buses, put 9 people in each bus, and we would have 27 Americans traveling around. The Europeans were unbelievably hospitable and helpful. And so we got to see organic farms in Germany, France, Switzerland, and England. And so when I see comments on regenerative websites that organic has been doing things wrong all along, I wonder, where are these people getting their information? Because the German farmers we visited, and this is back, the first trip was in 74. I was there again in 76 and 77 and 79. We saw farmers who were putting in a cover crop, a green manure crop, right after fall harvest and using them extensively throughout their farming. They were making compost, and the one thing that was surprising to all of us from America on those tours was they all emphasized that they always tried to till no deeper than 5 centimeters. So the idea that organic is somehow to be condemned by this new regenerative religion is ridiculous to me, and indicates that people need to read a little more history. Now, on that shelf on the bottom left, you see a book called Soils and Men. Now, that is a publication of the US Department of Agriculture. And it was, I think, one of the best things that they ever published. In there, even though it talks about all the good ideas, green manures, cover crops, crop rotation, et cetera, the phrase soil health is never mentioned. On the bottom of that picture on the right, there is another yearbook with the title Soil, 1957. That one does not mention the phrase soil health either. The regenerative movement has stolen the phrase soil health that has been at the heart of organic farming all these years, because they are trying to replace these ideas in the public mind. And it's really worth focusing on that and how effective these people can be. They steal the words and they ignore the concepts. So I just want to mention that at the start of this and say how much we learned on those early visits to organic farmers in Europe who were farming exactly the way I think organic farming should be done. They had nothing to learn from the new regenerative concepts, but for some reason, the people behind them are so good at what they do that they have managed to put that into far more minds than it should be in. So this is the sign at the entrance to our farm. We grow almost every crop. I think we grow 55 different vegetables. We do that because we are way out in the country, and if we want someone to come out here, they're going to be making a reasonable drive, and we want to have them be able to buy anything they want. What gets people to come out here is that we have specialized in quality. We make sure that if we put it up for sale, it is as absolutely perfect as it can be. And that has not been easy from the start because we had to create the soil, but it is something that can be achieved and is the one thing that will guarantee your success in farming, because that's what people want. People want exceptional food. And we have a reputation for producing exceptional food, and that brings customers here. This is the key, not the old guy, but the stuff he's holding there. Compost, we make a lot of compost. Organic matter, however, is what makes the soil work. And that's because it has the most ideal conditions for nourishing all the fungi and bacteria in the soil who are doing all the real work. When I started out, I tell people that the most influential book I read was not a book about farming. It was a book about soil microbiology by Selman Waxman. And it made me realize who is really in charge in this business. So we make as much compost as we can. I have neighbors who cut hay. If they get the hay rained on, I pay them baling costs and they'll bring me the bales, and we use those as walls around the heap. Eventually, the following year, that old hay becomes an ingredient in next year's heap. We turn the heap once after it's sat there for a year by putting it through a small manure spreader like this. And there are no miracles in agriculture, but compost is as close to a miracle, well-made compost, as you can have. The rest of our soil fertility comes from growing either green manures or working with livestock. Every year, we put at least a third of our vegetable land into a grass and legume pasture that is grazed by our laying hens. And there is nothing better for putting fertility into soil than the roots of grasses and legumes. You see in the background in that picture, 3 little small houses on wheels. Similar little wheeled structures for moving people around in the Far East are called rickshaws. We call these chickshaws because our chickens spend the night in there. Each one of those, small as they are, provides perfectly adequate roosting space for 50 laying hens, and they have laying boxes attached to them. This makes the fertility improvement on the farm a year after year project that is built in to a crop that we're selling. In the field, we try and use our land as efficiently as we can and plant it up with close spacing and using as many crop rotations as we can devise. And it's, again, the quality of what's coming out of there that makes the difference. So this is what one of our presentations at a farm market or on our farm stand looks like. If you can grow and put up radishes like this, they sell themselves. The customers can see that they're exceptional. In the greenhouses, we try and be just as efficient. We train the cucumbers vertically. We're getting great crops. We have a succession plantings of them coming along. And this is the crop of all of them that has made our farm most famous. We're very careful on how we produce carrots and how we take care of the soil that they're grown on. And we have found that if carrots follow a green manure of field peas and oats, they grow spectacularly. And if you choose a sweet variety like this is a variety called Mokum. Our carrots in the local area have a reputation. They're known as candy carrots. And I have been told by parents in the nearby towns that our carrots are what their children insist on having in their lunch pails when they go to school. Presentation at the market makes a difference. If you put things together that look nice and are well presented like this, they will basically sell themselves. So we're in a very cool area. We're near the North Atlantic coast of the United States. And so right from the start, we were very interested in anything we could do to provide better growing conditions for our crops by keeping things warmer. So in the background there, you see some low tunnels and a greenhouse. We started making low tunnels like this. We grow in 75 centimeter wide beds, and we can cover 2 of those beds with a low tunnel like this. Just a second, I have to move some information here. Great. And we can make those hoops very simply with a bending form. I contacted a gentleman who was making bending forms for making greenhouses, got him to make smaller ones for us to make low hoops out of. The material we're making them with, the thin pipe you see being bent around that form, is what is sold here as electrical metal tubing, EMT, and it's what an electrician would put wires through in an exposed situation so they couldn't be eaten by rodents. It's wonderful material, it's very inexpensive, and it allows us to make all sorts of, what would you call them, mini greenhouses that we can then place almost anywhere we want, either in the spring to speed up growth when it's still cool, or on into the fall to protect crops that we want to keep outside as long as possible. Of course, once you start bending pipe, you can have a lot of fun. So we actually make our own farm carts with that same bender and with just slightly heavier duty pipes. And we make these with the wheels far enough apart so this nicely straddles a 75 centimeter bed. We build a top for it. And in this way, you can have tools that are perfectly designed for what you're doing and allow you to move materials around very efficiently. If you're bending pipe, and here we're bending pipe to actually make greenhouses, we're using heavier duty pipe. In the front right of that picture, you can see the simpler bender that's used to make those smaller hoops. But one of the secrets to success in farming or anything else is to do all the supervision and have your children do all the work. So there is my daughter doing the work while I stand there and tell her what we need to do. We use the hoops that we can bend with that to make our own greenhouses. And we have a number of them that we can put up almost anywhere. Our crew has gotten very good at this. And the reason we love greenhouses is because where we live, starting about now and on through March, this is what winter looks like. It gets very cold. We will have winter temperatures as low as minus 30 centigrade. And we can have days in the winter when the temperature does not get warmer than minus 20 centigrade. So when we decided we wanted to extend our growing season, greenhouses were a logical way to go beyond the low tunnels. Inside the greenhouses, I'm sure you've seen all this before, we use the floating row covers to provide a second layer of protection. And what we have learned over the years of experimenting with this is that each layer, the greenhouse being one and the floating row cover being a second, moves the greenhouse each time 500 miles to the south, the crops inside, here on the east coast of the United States. So it allows us to grow during the winter a very, very wide variety of cold, hardy crops. Obviously, no tomatoes, no peppers, no eggplants, no cucumbers, but all sorts of hardy winter crops that do not mind cold conditions. My wonderful crew of hardworking young people occasionally minds winter conditions, but this is the reality of living in this part of the world. Once we started with greenhouses and wanted to use them to grow winter crops, we realized that if we were going to make them usable for the longest possible time, we needed to make them movable, because the crops that we wanted them to protect in the winter did not need to be in there in the summer. And in the summer, we can use them for growing the tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants that are difficult to grow in our cold climate. So this house in the front of this picture had grown tomatoes, I believe, in the summer. We've pulled that crop and we are towing this house, you can see my small tractor in the background, over crops that have been planted and ready to be harvested during the winter. And you can see this part of our farm from the road that goes by in front of the farm, and cars will often stop suddenly when they see this huge structure moving slowly across a field. It's not something that people are used to seeing. We have moved them a number of different ways. These early houses were built as sleds. So the bottom edges of the houses are like the runners of a sled on the ground. We then tried out a system where we put a wheel on the bottom of each hoop and had it roll on a pipe. And that was okay, but those wheels turned out to be expensive. But we wanted a greenhouse that moved even easier. And so we found wheels, even though they were more expensive because they had ball bearings in them. And even though they needed to roll on a track like this, allowed us to simplify the moving of greenhouses to the point that all we needed was two of us pushing a greenhouse like that back down the track to where it's going to cover this carrot crop for the first part of the winter. At the start, and this is a wonderful picture, you will notice on the left-hand side of the picture, the bottom of the door frame has been folded up. We are very ingenious when it comes to building things. But what we have done since one day when I walked by that greenhouse and I thought, oh, why don't we put the door in the side rather than the end? So even though we think we're occasionally brilliant, we are often occasionally stupid. We now have all the doors in the side and we don't have to worry. We can also open the bottom of the greenhouse. So when we want to slide it over the low tunnels, it has a crossbar and we can remove the plastic below that crossbar so we can slide it over like this. We also use, and you can see that in the end of this picture, what we call scissor doors. So if you can picture the way a pair of scissors works, from the top of that greenhouse, the there are two pieces of diagonal plastic attached, and we can vent the whole end of the greenhouse by just swinging them to the side and locking them in place. But what we've come up with finally is what we think is the best movable system of all. This is just a wheelbarrow wheel, and it is attached to a structure we built that allows the axle on the wheel to slide into a hole in the bottom edge of the greenhouse. And then, and you can see clearly in this picture, we then push the upper stem down and lock it in place. And in the process, that raises the greenhouse a couple of inches off the ground. We put 5 of these on each side of a 16 meter greenhouse. These are usually 10 meters wide. And you can see the greenhouse here and how easily it can be moved. And the nice thing about this system is these are the only 10 wheels we own, and we can use them for moving every greenhouse on the farm. Now, when you're using movable greenhouses, you have to realize that if you can move them, the wind can also. And it's very important to lock them thoroughly in place. The anchor in the ground there goes down over a meter and is screwed into the soil. So we have a good, stable anchor for it. If you make mistakes, and I guarantee you, we have made plenty of mistakes, you end up with a picture like this. This was one of our experimental greenhouse, homemade experimental greenhouses that we were in a little too much of a hurry when we put it up, and we didn't anchor it securely. I suppose the caption under this picture should be, whoops. The tools we use, we keep them as simple as possible. I first saw this tool in France on one of my earlier visits. It was designed by André Grélin, a small French farmer. And I believe Jean-Martin Fortier actually named his farm after it, the Ferme de la Grelinette. We find it extremely useful for just adding air to the soil without turning the soil over. And even though it is a bit of work in certain conditions, once you get the soil in good shape, you will find that it is no problem at all to use. When we wanted to mix, let us say, alfalfa meal or some simple powdered soil improver into the soil, at the start, we used this 3-tine cultivator. It was called by the young people who work here the human rototiller. They did not enjoy using it. In fact, it was the least popular job on the farm. And so I worked with a local engineer. I gave him the idea and I encouraged him to make it. And he created what is now sold by the Johnny's catalog as the tilther. And this is designed specifically to only turn the soil down to 2 inches deep. That idea came from reading weed research, which indicated that if weed seeds are buried more than 2 inches deep, they know they won't reach the surface before they run out of energy, and they're smart enough not to germinate and to just sit there in hopes someone will bring them up. This is designed just like a tractor rototiller. Unlike the small backyard tillers or the BCS, it does not have a gearbox in the center, but is driven by a chain on the left-hand side. But the best thing about it is so simple. Everybody I know nowadays has a cordless drill, and this highly technological arrangement allows us to just put a rope around the cordless drill, and it has plenty of power, especially with an 18-volt model like this, to run the tilther for quite a distance. After we mix the amendment into the soil, we rake the bed smooth. And this is one of the many results from trips I took to Europe when I am not your normal tourist. I don't go to art museums, I go to hardware stores. And so I found this rake at a store in Austria, and it is now imported and sold here. I found this wonderful little cedar from Semner, a German company, again in a hardware store. And it is proven to be the perfect tool for putting multiple rows of crops on a 30-inch, or excuse me, a 75-centimeter bed. You can plant 25 centimeters of the bed with each pass. When we wanted something even more professional, I got together with the same engineer who made the tilther, and we came up with this 6-row cedar, which instead of 3 trips up and down the bed now only requires 2, and is very, very close to many of the quite professional greenhouse bed cedars that I saw on trips to Europe many years ago. What that allows us to do is to sow crops like carrots at 12 rows on a 75-centimeter bed and get fantastic yields. The reason we want to do that is because the space in a greenhouse has cost us money to protect with the greenhouse, and we want to maximize our yields from that area. If you do plant crops like carrots at this density, obviously you can't cultivate them. And this is where flame weeding is very useful. This is a flame torch, and we just created a little hood for the front, a roller for the back, so it goes down one side of a 75-centimeter bed, and then you come back and you have gotten rid of all the little weed seeds before the crop comes up. This is known in English as pre-emergence flaming. So here is a series of 3 slides. The first one is of crops that are ready, either being harvested now, like you can see in the right of the picture, or ready to be harvested shortly, that will be harvested during November and the early part of December. You saw 3 greenhouses earlier in that picture of the snowy scene. So this is one of them. The second greenhouse, on the same day I took this picture, looked like this. These are all younger crops planted later. And the third greenhouse looked like this. So this is just to demonstrate that if you are going to try and go over the winter, when growth is so much slower because day length is so much shorter, you need to have it planned ahead in the fall and have figured out how to time your sowings so they will mature one after another on into the winter and then early spring. The crops we were growing in these days were mostly small leaves of salad crops for what is called over in England, baby leaf salad. And one of the tools we desperately needed was a way to harvest these mechanically. And we had made a number of designs ourselves, but we never found one that worked well enough. And a wonderful young farmer was visiting with his family, and he seemed to have some skills, and farmers everywhere have amazing skills. And he was interested in the failures we had created so far. So I showed them to him, and I said, I hope you can do better. Fortunately, he could. His name is Jonathan Dysinger, and he now has a company called Farmer's Friend. And what he did was add that wonderful set of spinning cords on the front of the harvester to push the cut material back into the basket. We hadn't thought of that. We had thought, wouldn't that be wonderful if we could have something like that? Jonathan came up with it, and this was really a great salvation. But it allowed us to produce some of the most beautiful salad anyone saw, but we were always thinking maybe we could do better. And so what you had with Jonathan's harvester was a mechanical solution. But we're always wondering, oh, isn't there a biological solution? And when the new Salanova lettuces became available, that became our biological solution. And so you can see some of these have been cut once and are regrowing. Some of them have not been cut yet, but we have a whole greenhouse looking like this during the winter. We heat it just minimally to keep it just above freezing. And this gives us a production of baby leaf salad right through the cold months with an advantage. The difficulty of growing it from the young leaves that had been so much a part of baby leaf was that they're only 30 days old. They don't have much structure to them, and they haven't yet achieved enough flavor. These heads, and they're designed so when you cut the leaves, they're all attached at the bottom and they break apart into a bunch of small leaves. These are mature heads. They have the full flavor they should have. And this is just such a wonderful example where a biological solution took the place of a mechanical solution. Here is another mechanical solution, very easy to make. You just go to the plumbing store where you live and just buy some pipe. You can easily make something like this. But we wanted it because we wanted a way to plant leeks so we could cover them with a greenhouse in the winter. And this just makes a hole in the ground about 23, 24 centimeters deep, into which we drop leek plants that are about 26, 27 centimeters tall. And when you first see it done, you can't believe it's going to work. It just works fantastically. And this allows us to plant leeks close enough so now we don't have to go through there with a tractor and hill the soil up over them, that we can cover them with a greenhouse. Why do we need to cover them with a greenhouse? Because when the outdoor temperatures in Maine go to 30 degrees centigrade below zero, the leeks would get killed out of doors. And this is what we can turn out with protecting them with a greenhouse. And we learned from the start that if we wanted to harvest them through the winter, they had to be under some sort of protection like this. Another example of that, if you're doing things on the small farm and you have an imagination, there is nothing that's impossible. We grow all of our seedlings in soil blocks. I first saw this technology on a small farm in Switzerland many years ago, and I thought it was the best I'd ever seen. We use semi-professional hand soil block makers to make the blocks. We also make small blocks for starting many seeds on a heat pad if we want to. And when we are ready to put them in the ground, it's nice to be able to have the soil marked out in a grid so we know where they should go. There are tools for sale in the US that are very expensive, very heavy, and very inelegant looking, that you roll down a bed and they leave a pattern, a grid pattern for transplanting. The thing is that they cost hundreds of dollars. And it seemed to me like there should be a better way. We had come up with a better way years ago. We just put these marker teeth on that same rake you saw that we used to smooth out the bed, and change the spacing, whether we are going down the bed or across the bed. But it leaves a grid that you can then transplant very effectively into, whether you're in the greenhouse or out in the field. And the idea that I could replace those red fingers on the rake, which cost me about $5, by buying a couple of $300–400 worth of very heavy rolling markers, just seems ridiculous. We have kept with this same system, and we are very fond of it. We grow a lot of crops that we shouldn't grow. In the US, everybody assumes the Californians will do everything. And as an Easterner, I will admit they have a wonderful climate and that they're all beautiful and they hang out with movie stars and they know how to surf, but that makes it all the more desirable to compete with them. So we were told we couldn't do globe artichokes because the plants won't survive our winters, and that's true. We cannot winter them over. They are not perennial where I live. But what we learned by experimenting was that if we planted them in February and 6 weeks later moved the plants to an area where it was very cold, not quite freezing, and then 6 weeks later put them in the ground, the artichoke plants thought that the first 6 weeks in the warm seed starting greenhouse was their first summer. They thought the next 6 weeks was their first winter. And so when we put them in the ground, they thought they were 2 years old and should produce artichokes. They did. We have wonderful fields of absolutely beautiful artichokes. And this is just another example. No matter what they tell you is impossible, I guarantee you it isn't impossible. In fact, the caption under this picture is "Eat your heart out, California. We can do it better." Other crops we grow that most people can't imagine is watercress. We buy the seeds, we sow them in beds of potting soil about 5 centimeters thick, maybe 6 centimeters thick, on the floor of a greenhouse, and add mist to the air over them. And this produces an absolutely beautiful watercress that where we don't have to worry about whether the stream it is growing in has pollution from upstream. We control weeds with hose, either a hand hose like this or wheel hose. You will notice the position of the hands of the workers. You want to hold a good cultivating hoe with your thumbs up the handle because it allows you to use it as a draw hoe rather than a chopping hoe. If you use a chopping hoe, your thumbs are pointing down the handle. And when we designed the collinear hoe, we worked with people from short to tall, and we found that a 70-degree angle was almost the ideal angle if you wanted to be able to stand upright and use it. And this has been very successful. But the one thing we did notice that since we are aiming to cut larger weeds occasionally with this, we sharpen the edge. And that means if you are using it, if you bump accidentally into the stem of a plant, you can hurt it. So we decided to make a hoe that would be the same width, but that if we bumped it into the stem of a plant, it wouldn't hurt it. But if used on very small weeds, what are called in English white thread stage weeds, their roots are like a white thread. is incredibly effective. And the first year I made these, our farm crew went around calling them the eraser, like the thing on the end of a pencil that erases your mistakes. So we decided weeds were a mistake. If you want to make one, take a bolt enough bigger than the wire you're using so you can drill a hole through it like this. Take a piece of wire and put it in a vise and bend it around and bend the ends like that so you can stick them through the hole in the bolt. And then attach, if you look at the wire hole on the bottom left of that picture, you will see that at the end of the green part, I have welded on a nut, and I can then thread that bolt that has the wires through it in there and attach on any size I want. This has been very successful, and I always try not to buy anything I can make myself. However, large-scale weeding can be done with the help of the sun and plastic technology. So this was a greenhouse. It had more weed pressure than we wanted. We didn't need it one summer in the middle of July. And so we cleaned it out, wet the soil down really well because heat transmits best down through a wet soil, spread plastic over the whole surface, and used a technique called solarizing or solarization, which is used in hot countries and never used up here in our part of the world because we don't get enough heat and sun. But in the greenhouse, where we could shut the greenhouse up to create a climate like way down in the hot country, it was amazing. And and I have never had better weed control the following few years in a greenhouse than we had in this greenhouse after doing that. We grow, come back here, you. We grow a lot of crops out of season that most people wouldn't. These are seed potatoes that we are sprouting. We sprout them at 70 degrees Fahrenheit, which is what, about 20 centigrade. It gets more sprouts on them than if you allow them to sprout when it's cooler. And then we plant them as early as possible in one of our greenhouses early in the spring under a layer of floating fabric. And we are selling small new potatoes by the 7th of May, about the same time when farmers around here are just beginning to plant their outdoor potatoes. So little tricks like this make an enormous difference and allow us to keep our customers happy and keep them interested and keep them purchasing throughout the whole year. Here is what we call in English Swiss chard. It is usually sold in very large leaves with thick stems. And there are some people who like the stems. There are some who don't. We learned to harvest the leaves when they were younger and tender, about the size of your hand. And we renamed it butter chard. Now, anyone knows if you put the phrase butter in with a food, it makes it appealing. But it was very appealing to all the restaurants we sold to. And they immediately put a butter chard salad on their menus. A little bit of marketing goes a long way. So we've been very fortunate over the years to find young people like the same age as many of you who wanted to learn farming and were willing to come and work with us. And it has been a delightful experience for us, and I hope for them too. At our age, we consider them as part of our family, as our children, and we keep in touch with them long after they've left. We teach them all sorts of skills, like putting up this trellis for peas, so pea harvest is simpler and easier. we are using there that same electrical metal tubing because it has many other uses than bending into hoops. And so whether they're doing work like this, or they're harvesting and learning different ages that our restaurant clients want different crops, whether they're freezing their fingers in the winter, harvesting cold weather crops like this spinach from an unheated greenhouse, and spinach is, for us, the absolute best winter crop, or learning that there are very imaginative ways of marketing. This is the way we sell our Brussels sprouts. It saves us a lot of work, and the customers love it. They love walking out of our farm stand or the store with this ridiculous looking stem of Brussels sprouts, which keeps the product much fresher. In our largest greenhouse, we provide a little heat in the winter so we can do all sorts of a wider variety of crops. If you look on both edges of that picture, you will see that the snow outside against the edges of the greenhouse is about 1 meter tall. This is a typical winter picture here. But inside this greenhouse, you have a perpetual spring. We provide the little bit of heat it needs by burning wood. And so one other thing we have done is tried not to create waste where we didn't have to. And so many of the boxes that are used to transport food in the US, we are not wise about this and don't have recyclable plastic crates like I used to see all over Europe. But we built our own crates out of a cedar wood that we cut on the farm and had a local sawmill cut for us. And when we deliver in these to the stores, they keep the boxes, and we get them back when we deliver more the next time, and we wash them out and reuse them. And we found, whoops, go back there, you. We found a cellophane product, not plastic, but cellophane. Cellophane is made from tree material that we could use to cover them. And the beauty of it is that it is only made from pure wood fiber, and it can be composted. So whereas on average, 25% of the packaging from food crops goes into the local landfill, nothing from our farm goes there. And we were rather pleased with that. This is our farm shop, as the British call it, or farm store. In there, during the summer, we sell all sorts of products, almost everything you can imagine. During the winter, we sell at a winter farmer market in a town nearby. And the main reason for all of this, obviously, is to feed people and to feed them well. This is a dinner that a large California organization known as Outstanding in the Field held a number of times on our farm. We found a local chef, we provided the food, they provided the experienced team to set this up, and it was absolutely delightful experience. But through all of this, and now we have to go back to the pictures I started with, I have been fascinated by the fact that we're doing the impossible according to everything I was told when I started. It's impossible to grow food without chemicals and without pesticides. We do it successfully year after year. So I wanted a way to demonstrate that to people. Along with having been a rock climber and whitewater kayaker, I was an ice hockey player, probably of all the sports I've done, the one I enjoyed the most. And so the irrigation pond on our farm, when we had it dug, we had made in the size and shape of a hockey rink. So when it froze in the winter, we could play hockey on it. When it freezes in the early fall, the first ice that forms, and it will quickly get to be 2-3 inches thick, is what is known to skaters as black ice. Absolutely beautiful, the best stuff to skate on, and you can't tell it's there, you can see right down through it. If a little water falls, if you have a rainstorm after the black ice has formed on the pond, it looks like water. And so with my daughter's help, we took this picture one early December. The pond had enough ice on it that I could walk on it. We had a ½ inch of rain. And for all of those of you who are getting into farming, the thing you're always told is the most impossible thing to do is to walk on water. Well, organic farmers have been walking on water since we started, and I encourage you to keep walking on water. And I thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Eliot, for the many insights, both into the history of the organic movement as you see it, and as well as some of the innovations that you've been able to kind of start and invent on your farm.
I tell people the innovations come from the fact that I'm basically very lazy. And whenever I'm doing a job I don't like, I try and figure out how to make it easier.
The innovations from the lazy farmers.
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm gonna look in our chat. There's a few questions already here that I'd like to begin with. Yeah, the first one is, how do you prevent fungal problems in the polytunnels? How do you manage and prevent condensation in the polytunnels?
Yes, there are some very good winter vegetable growers in the US. And one of the best is a couple over in New York State, Paul and Sandy Arnold. And what they do is, rather than trying to shut everything up tight, which you would think you would want to do to prevent cold air from getting in, they actually leave vents open so the extra moist air will vent out, can leave the house. And they have found that maybe that makes it a little bit colder in there, but that little bit colder is of no problem, and not having the extra moisture to cause the difficulties with fungal diseases is a great benefit.
Thank you. Yeah, I know that Wolfgang Palme is a big propagator of aeration in tunnels. So of really leaving the windows open in the mornings for 10 minutes because it's often a lack of light and not heat in our,
yes.
Yeah.
Well, Wolfgang is an exceptionally competent experimenter. His information is very sound.
Yeah. Then we have a question hang on. A question to the type of soil that you use for your soil blocks. Are there soil combinations that are without peat moss, or what are the possibilities there?
Yes, I realize that my use of peat moss runs into objections over on the other side of the ocean, but I explain in my book that on the North American continent, it is a renewable resource. There are people making decent potting mixes where coconut fiber replaces the peat. And long before, if you read back, and again, the library here, I have books going way, way back. Before people started using peat, and that basically came out of research in England back in the 40s, they were using leaf mold. And leaf mold, we're talking deciduous leaves, the ones that fall to the ground in the fall, used to provide a pretty good substitute for peat moss in mixes. The other thing that the old mixes used was the word loam in English, L-O-A-M. Most people consider it just means topsoil. It doesn't. Technically, it meant cutting the top 4 inches of sod off a fertile pasture, stacking those upside down for a couple of years and letting that rot down. And those 4 inches of sod with all the grass and legume roots in there gave you a wonderful material for using in making potting soil. When we started, as you might remember from what I said about how we started, we had no fields of sod to do that with. So we started mixing soil and peat together to try and duplicate that. But if you can make a loam as it was traditionally made and have access to or can make some leaf mold, I think you'll find you can make a very good potting soil. I mentioned in my book that we did experiment with whether you could make a good natural potting soil. And we found that if you go into the forest, a forest where there are hardwood trees, and where you'll often find dead tree trunks on the floor of the forest, that the insides of maple and birch, when the trunk is well rotted, if you crumbled those up and mixed them with soil and compost, made a wonderful potting soil. And it was totally natural.
There's one more question, or there's another question about possible heating sources for greenhouses. You spoke a little bit about making a fire. Do you have any experience with passive soil heating?
Yes, there have been experiments over here using the heat from a compost heap. Compost is exothermic when you make it and gives off heat. And building your compost heaps in a greenhouse, so the heat they give off would be in the greenhouse. And we've tried everything. And what you really have to think about and what you run into with those is, yes, you have found a very effective, ecologically sound way to do it. But the excess work you're doing and the fact that it complicates harvest and planting and all of those things are other things to think about. That's why just when we need heat in that one greenhouse, burning wood seemed the most reasonable and environmentally sound answer to it.
Sure, yeah. Then a question about, out of your experience view, what would be an important advice to give people who want to start a market garden?
Oh, usually, I don't know if this translates into German, but usually people don't quit your day job. I don't know how that translates to German.
Also verlasse nicht dein normale Beruf gleich oder sofort.
It is going to be the hardest work you've ever done and the most satisfying work you've ever done. And you definitely will be pleased eventually that you did it. But it isn't as easy as it is often pictured. And the best example I can give you was back in the, the 1930s in England, when some English vegetable growers visited Paris. Actually, no, not the 30s. This was 1905. They visited Paris, where there was all those wonderful Parisian market gardens that were taking advantage of the horse manure from the stables and not only feeding Paris, but were exporting vegetables to England. And the English growers came over to visit and they said, oh my gosh, this is a great system. And English newspapers picked up on it and published books about the wonderfully easy money, you can get rich French system of growing vegetables. What the books and the articles didn't point out was how hard the work was. And it seemed miraculous. And it's the same I've seen with people who visit a raspberry farm and they see the demand for freshly picked raspberries. And they said, oh my gosh, this is a great money-making scheme. Well, it may be, but you sure have to work hard at it anyway.
Could you give us a little bit more background on what regenerative agriculture stands for in North America, who and what is behind it, and what are the discrepancies with organic farming? Yeah,
I noticed in the literature on the Stiftung website that you had praise for Gabe Brown. And Gabe Brown is an ex-chemical farmer who has become very well known by giving talks about how he has changed his farm. If you look at it, Gabe Brown took over his family's farm that had been farmed with chemicals for years, and the originally fertile soil had been destroyed, which was why he had to regenerate, because the people before him had degenerated the soil. Now, he is an excellent farmer, and he is doing more than an old hippie like me could ever do in talking regular large-scale farmers into farming better, because he's farming on their scale, he speaks their language, he's doing an excellent job. But what he is not admitting is that the reason he needs to regenerate is that all those years of chemical farming destroyed the soil. And whether he is aware of this or not, I'm sure he is making the chemical companies happy by not saying that. He is merely singing the praises of all of these techniques that the organic system kept alive for the last 100 years. Green manures, cover crops, crop rotation, mixed farming, all of these were part of organic farming. The grazing systems of Alan Savory, they came from the work of a French researcher by the name of André Voisin. And André Voisin's ideas were very popular with all the organic growers, long before Savory came along and adopted the ideas. So the ideas that are being explained as being regenerative and new are actually just organic farming ideas that the people who destroyed their soil with chemicals don't want to admit are basically organic farming, because they have never liked those words to begin with. So it is an attempt, as I said in one of the articles I sent to Manuel for background, it is an attempt to displace organic in the mind of the public, because we are still a threat to the chemical companies. And all of the people who are now interested in no-till, and they are quoting to me all these studies on no-till, need to ask themselves, who did the studies on no-till. And if you look at the studies on no-till, they were done by the chemical companies who were trying to sell herbicides. And the only way you could run no-till before a number of very inventive organic farmers came up with roller crimpers and other things was using herbicides. So all of the justification of no-till that supposedly comes from science initially came from the chemical companies trying to sell herbicides. And even the best of the regenerative growers, like Gabe Brown, still occasionally use herbicides. And those herbicides are probably glyphosate, which has been shown to destroy the biological life in the soil. So even though they say, well, we only use a little anymore, I mean, so are they farming better than they did before? Absolutely. I don't want to change what Gabe Brown has achieved. I just want to point out to people that these ideas are nothing new in regenerative, and that they do not want to allow regenerative to somehow gloss over all of its flaws by adopting the words that used to describe organic farming. I'm just a suspicious old hippie, that's all.
Yeah, thank you for putting it in context, because I think for many people who arrive new to the scene, it's incredibly important to know the history of the movement before jumping on the regenerative bandwagon.
Yeah.
Another question, after all these great inventions, what is the new frontier, in your opinion, in tool solution making? In other words, are there challenges that you have not found a technical solution for?
Oh, yes, but it's really interesting. I was working with my engineer friend to see if we couldn't come up with a roller that had plates sticking out of it, about 5 centimeters long. And so when it rolled along, when those plates were in the ground, there was a cam that would hit us and spring open and make square holes for putting soil blocks in. So as you rolled this down the bed, you would have a bed that already had the square holes, and they hadn't been pressed in. They had been opened. And I was showing my designs for all of this to my daughter, Clara, who is now running the farm and making the decisions. And she looked at me and she said, "Why are you doing that? We're very efficient as we are just doing it all by hand." So in her mind, I was trying to solve a problem that she did not consider to be a problem. And I thought that was a wonderful answer. So maybe we have become pretty efficient, but I love the idea of being able to replace mechanical solutions with biological solutions. And so rather than using a chisel plow, if we can find the best possible deep-rooted green manure that will do that breakup of the pan down below by biological methods, then that's another tool we can get rid of. Now, and the one last thing is tillage. And everybody now is against tilling. But when I began here, there is no way we could have created the farm we have without tilling. And I still do not believe that tillage is damaging if you are adding organic matter to the soil, if you are mixing it in. And as the European farmers suggested years ago, and what they were doing, we limit that to 5 centimeters, maybe 10 centimeter depth at most, because when organic matter decomposes in the soil, it makes acids that etch nutrients, minerals, out of the soil particles. So you're actually fertilizing for next year's crops by mixing organic matter into the top surface of the soil.
Okay. Now a question about intercropping or relay cropping. Do you practice this yourself on your farm, and how do you tackle amending interplanted beds?
Yes, we do not have any interplanted beds. We have found that we are more efficient if we put the rows of the crop we're trying to grow as close together as possible and get as much yield in a shorter period of time, and then re-prepare it and put another crop in. And if we have other beds, other fields around the farm, that allows us to have the same effect as intercropping. The one time I saw very successful intercropping was on a farm in Switzerland years ago, where they had carrots and leeks growing in rows side by side all over this field. And then they had fields of just carrots and just leeks. And they were getting higher yields per square meter where they had them in alternating rows. And they came to the conclusion that the carrot roots went down, the leek roots went sideways, and it was a wonderful partnership. And it probably was. But it made the planting and harvesting enough more complicated that I would prefer to have a field of each separately.
Thank you. A question, are you able to produce all the compost that you use on your farm, or do you have to buy compost as an off-farm input?
Yes, this is a wonderful question now, because we have been supplementing the compost we make with purchased compost, but we have been buying it from an organic dairy farm. And it is the purest, most wonderful organic compost you could imagine. Too much of what people are buying, especially the people copying Richard Perkins and putting down a great depth of pure compost, the quality of the compost would make me very nervous, because waste product composts can have all sorts of unpleasant ingredients in them that are putting bad chemicals into the soil. However, even though the compost we have been getting is very pure, we have stopped this year buying supplemental compost. And we are planning on running this farm from now on with just green manures. And so let's say I've just finished a crop and I till the crop residues shallowly into the soil. That saves me a lot of work, because I don't have to take them to the compost heap. And then as soon as I can, I plant a green manure on that soil. And I think this will be a better system. The reason I'm motivated to do that is I don't believe that any farm that is dependent on inputs, whether they're organic inputs or chemical inputs, but any farm dependent on inputs is not independent. It can be held up by someone not supplying that input. And if the rest of the world has to think that organic farming means buying 6 inches of compost or all of the other schemes I read about, then organic farming is not a universal solution for people in underdeveloped countries where none of those inputs are available. And that's why, for me, the idea that organic is developed as a system whose soil needs are grown in the soil itself is the only way it's going to be universal.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a very important point, especially looking at developing countries as far as their limited resource on organic matter and how to make it on site. I think that's an incredibly important issue. A classic question about the slug problem. Do you have one, and what do you do?
We have one greenhouse that for some reason has always had a slug problem. The other ones don't, just this one. Whatever, I've never figured out how the conditions differ. But I was just there this morning, and we have a newly planted bed of young arugula next to where the slug problem is. And there are small containers of beer sunk into the soil along the edge of the bed, and they were filled with slugs. So that is still a very good old-time solution. The one time I thought I absolutely had it solved was when we had ducks. We used to have ducks for eggs, and we would fence them. So the area around the greenhouse was where they spent all their time. And there was no way a slug could crawl across what we called duck country in order to get to the greenhouse. So if it were possible in the off season to turn them loose in that greenhouse with the slug problem, I suppose that would help. But we don't have ducks for eggs anymore because it turns out that my wife is allergic to duck eggs.
Thank you. I like the picture, the image of a mob grazing duck crew.
Yes.
Thank you. There's a question here about green pathways, if you have experimented with them or if you keep your pathways blank.
Yeah, no, we have experimented with them. We don't use them. And I actually made a cover that fit over the end of my string trimmer, so I could string trim the green pathway and the cuttings would not be thrown onto the crops. But it seemed a lot of work for what I was gaining. And I have seen pictures and talked to some of the young, very enthusiastic American no-till growers. And they are all bringing in leaf mold or special shredded wood to put in their paths. And I notice Richard Perkins does that too. Boy, that's an awful lot of work. And I have never seen that the path really suffered from not having anything growing in it, especially because that's where we walk, which is why we have a path. Hello, Manuel.
Thank you. There's a question a little bit about your, what is your marketing situation? Are you able to market? Are you near a city? Is it does it go through a CSA, on site? Just a little context.
Yes, we market only within about 50 kilometers of the farm. We have been asked by chefs in other parts of the world if we would come and or send food to them. And we tell them we will come and show their local growers how to do what we do, but we think food should be local. The reason we grow so many different crops is because for the area we serve, we are like a supermarket, and you go to the supermarket to buy everything, so we try and have everything. And in a way that limits our income, because many of these crops do not return as much money per square meter as other crops. So I've noticed that Curtis Stone only grows the high return crops. And so if we did that, we could claim to have twice the income that we have at the moment. But by supplying everything to our loyal clientele, we keep them loyal. Last year, 2019, we had a gross sales of $220,000 on 2 acres, which is pretty good for a small farm in the middle of nowhere. And our prices are not excessive. Our prices very often are lower than supermarket prices because it's a crop we can grow very effectively. So we direct sell to the local neighborhood. We have an on-farm shop, and we have that winter farmers market. And then we do wholesale to stores and restaurants.
Thank you. A little bit of a technical question. How many seeds are you seeding in your 12-row carrot beds per meter? And what is your yield per square meter? I'm not sure if you have this in meters or if you want to do it in feet, and then we can convert it. And also, I guess just, do you use the same spacing for the greenhouses as for outside?
Yes. When we started doing 12 rows of carrots on a 75 centimeter bed, we did it in the greenhouse. And we seed at a rate that puts one seed we add extra seeds to make sure. We want to have one carrot every, let's see, 2.5 centimeters in the row. So in each row, I want a carrot every 2.5 centimeters, 2 carrots every 5 centimeters. The rows are just 5 centimeters apart. And I think I can, but anyway, we try and give each carrot just enough space so it gets all the light and soil that it needs. And this has been very effective, and our yields are just strikingly good. I can't tell you, if my daughter were here, she would be able to tell you the number of pounds per square meter. But if I thought I could improve it, I would. I haven't been able to improve it yet. And the other question was about...
if you use the same spacing in the tunnels as outside.
So when we learned in the greenhouse how successful that was, we started doing it in the field. And it turned out it was just as successful in the field. So that's how we now plant all of our salad carrots. We also grow storage carrots that we grow larger, and we give them more space because they're going to go into a cellar for the depths of the winter after the salad carrots have all been sold.
Thank you. So salad carrots would be Buntware in German, and storage carrots would be Lagergemüse.
The sweetest, the storage carrots are larger.
Yeah.
And the salad carrots are smaller and sweeter.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah.
Then a question to, what types of cover crops do you grow, when and why?
Yes. If I want as much organic matter in the soil as possible, I will grow winter rye and vetch together, and winter vetch. If I want the green manure to die over winter so I can plant early in the spring, I plant a combination of field peas and oats, because in our winter climate, they both get killed, and there's nothing that I need to till under in the spring, I can just rake the surface and plant directly into it, which saves a lot of time. In the summer, we use buckwheat, and it has an advantage. It grows quickly, it smothers weeds, but also it breaks down very quickly. So I can more quickly follow it with another crop in the summer because it doesn't need as long to decompose in the soil. The one odd green manure we use, where you saw in the picture, the chickens, our chickens grazing on that pasture, very often in a pasture, you will get wire worms. I don't know what the German word for wire worms is.
Drahtwürmer.
Okay. If we are coming out of pasture in the fall, we sow a high, and the word in English is glycosinolate, a mustard green manure that's high in a certain mustard quality. And it makes the wireworms very unhappy and they go away. And so if the following year after that, we're planting a crop like potatoes that would be bothered by the wireworms, we have a way of dealing with them. But we basically keep the green manures very simpler, peas, oats, rye, vetch, and buckwheat.
Good, thank you. A technical question, do you sow your cover crops or do you seed them per hand?
Yeah, two things. If I'm putting them on a bed, I use a 5-row Jang seeder, and a 5-row Jang seeder has the seeding things close enough together. They go down one side of the 75-centimeter bed and back the other side, and the whole bed is sown. If it's a field, I have a chest seeder, and I turn a handle as I walk down the field, and the seeds from a container on my chest are spread out. And then I have a roller with ridges on it that I then drive over the field to put those seeds in close contact with the soil.
Die letzte Beschreibung war von einem Tellerstreuer auf Deutsch. Final question for tonight. I mean, we could keep you here all night long with the amount of questions that are here in our chat, but I'm selecting one last question. And has to do a little bit with crop rotation and cabbage. I know it's an issue that a lot of market gardeners run into, especially if they're trying to grow for the entire season, including all the cabbage storage crops. Do you have anything to say about how many years in between growing cabbage on the same plot is necessary, and what is your experience there?
Okay, not living in Germany and not having as many customers as I would if I did there who want cabbage for their sauerkraut and other dishes. We sell some cabbage in the summer for summer salads, but most of the cabbage we sell in the winter. And so it doesn't come back onto the same land for 3 years, not because I have done it that way. That's just the way the crop rotation works. The cabbage field, though, is one that is interesting if you want to investigate what you do about crop residues when you're trying to run a no-till system. If you know what a flail mower is, a flail mower, and I have one with little teeth on it in the shape of the letter Y. And I took the roller off the back that keeps it from going too deep. And I drive over the field after we have harvested the cabbages, and I let the teeth on the flail mower go about 1 centimeter into the soil. And so in the process of that, I chop up the stumps of the cabbage, and I also get rid of the tops of the roots. And that makes it so much easier the next spring to replant that field, because I have chopped up all of those brassica stump residues that otherwise take a long time to break down. And this has been very successful.
Thank you. A flail mower ist auf Deutsch eine Fräse, also quasi eine ausgeschaltete Fräse, in dem Fall, den er rüberfährt.
Yeah.
Oder ein Einachs mit Fräse. Yeah, thank you so much, Eliot, for this very inspiring and informative chat. I think we've all been taking our notes and have definitely learned a few new things, and also I think particularly valuable the bigger context with your long experience in the field. So,
well, Maya, thank you for your help. I'm very pleased to meet an American who has actually bothered to learn a foreign language.